On a cold morning of January 20th, 1943, when Europe was shaking under the noise of war, one man decided he had heard enough orders. Baron Jean de Selys Longchamps, a Belgian aristocrat who had become an RAF pilot, he had never been given permission for this mission, but he knew his commanders would never approve it. But sometimes in history, orders lose their power, and only the heart decides what must be done. He strapped himself into his Hawker Typhoon, switched off his radio as if cutting every command that tried to stop him, and sent his wingman back to base. Then he dove toward Brussels alone, flying so close to the rooftops that the windows rattled. These were the streets of Brussels, a city where he had spent part of his youth, were now under German control, but now controlled by men in black uniforms with skull badges. He carried the pain and anger of a nation that had been crushed under the boots of its occupiers, and the pain of people suffering under the SS and Gestapo. And then, rising ahead of him like a dark stone tower against the winter sky, the 12-story building was one of the main offices of the Gestapo and SD in Brussels, a place where screams went unanswered and people vanished without a trace. No one knows exactly how the German officers reacted at that moment, but witnesses said the engine noise shook the building just before the gunfire began, and in that silent second, they must have understood what was coming. Vengeance had arrived, and it carried the markings of the Royal Air Force. He was one of the very few pilots, and likely the most well-known one, who chose to attack the occupiers of his homeland on his own. But why would a man of privilege risk everything for one unauthorized moment of fury? To answer that, we must go back to the beginning, back to a city drowning in fear. In early 1943, Brussels was a city that had learned to live with terror. For over 2.5 years, the Nazis had been tightening their grip on the Belgian capital, and they had become very, very good at it. The Gestapo and SS security police didn't just set up shop in Brussels after Belgium fell in May 1940. They turned the occupation into something methodical, something designed to crush not just resistance, but the very idea of hope itself. They took over the Résidence Belvédère, a handsome Art Deco building at 453 Avenue Louise. Before the war, it had been the kind of place where well-dressed people lived comfortable lives, where the elevator operators knew your name, and the doorman tipped his hat. The building stood in one of Brussels' finest neighborhoods, surrounded by cafes and shops where, in another time, people met for afternoon coffee and conversation. Now those same cafes served Germans, and the conversations happened in whispers, if they happened at all. The Gestapo transformed number 453 into something out of a nightmare. The numbers tell part of the story, though numbers can never tell the whole truth of such things. From the end of 1942 into early 1943, dozens of civilians were killed in what the occupiers called retaliation operations, and these deaths created a deep fear across the city. 68 people who woke up one morning not knowing it would be their last. They were ordinary people, the kind you'd pass on the street without a second glance. Bakers who got up before dawn to start the ovens, teachers who tried to educate children in a world gone mad, mothers who worried about feeding their families, young people who made the mistake of looking at a German officer the wrong way, or being caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The occupiers weren't just maintaining order, they were crushing even the whisper of rebellion, stamping out any ember that might grow into flame. Resistance members vanished from their beds in the middle of the night, taken away in cars that moved through the streets without headlights. Many Jewish families were taken from their homes during night raids in 1942 to 43, often without time to prepare, and their absence left a quiet, painful emptiness in their neighborhoods. Every Belgian knew that the thick black cloud of fear hanging over their heads could swallow them next, without warning, without mercy, without anyone ever knowing what happened. Avenue Louise became known as the Street of No Return. Everyone in Brussels knew the terrible arithmetic of that address. Get dragged into number 453, and your family might never see you again. The stories multiplied, each one worse than the last, each one confirming what everyone already feared. From the building's basement came sounds that made people cross to the other side of the street. People spoke of interrogation rooms where the screaming could go on for hours, of bodies that were never returned to families, of confessions extracted through methods that no civilized person should have to imagine. The SS unit based at Avenue Louise was one of the most feared groups in Belgium, and its reputation for cruelty spread far beyond the neighborhood. They were efficient, these men in their black uniforms. They kept records with German precision, they followed procedures, and they showed no mercy whatsoever to anyone they suspected of working against the Reich. By January 1943, fear and despair gripped Brussels like a winter cold that wouldn't break. People went about their daily lives because they had no choice, but they moved through the streets with their eyes down, their voices low, always aware that someone might be watching, always conscious that the wrong word to the wrong person could mean a visit from the men at number 453. The weight of occupation pressed down on everyone, making it hard to breathe, hard to remember what freedom had felt like, hard to believe it would ever come again. Then Baron Jean de Selys Longchamps decided to strike a blow at this symbol of Nazi power, and everything changed. Longchamps was born into an aristocratic family in Brussels, the kind of family where names carried weight and history stretched back generations. His father was Baron Raymond de Selys Longchamps, a man of the old nobility, and young Jean grew up in a world of privilege that most people only glimpsed from a distance. He had the kind of childhood where doors opened automatically, where the future seemed mapped out in comfortable certainty, where tradition dictated that a young man of his station would follow in his father's footsteps and live a life of respectable service. But Jean showed a rebellious spirit from an early age, the kind of restlessness that didn't fit well with drawing rooms and formal dinners. He was not what anyone would call a model student. He shifted from school to school with the frequency of someone who couldn't quite find where he belonged, displaying what his teachers probably described, with varying degrees of exasperation, as a fickle and adventurous temperament. He seemed to be looking for something that the comfortable world of Belgian aristocracy couldn't provide, though in those early years he likely couldn't have said what that something was. Nevertheless, family tradition carried its own gravity, and Jean chose a military path. It was expected, it was honorable, and perhaps it offered the kind of structure and purpose his restless spirit needed. By 1937, in his mid-20s, he had graduated from the officers' school and received his commission as a cavalry sub-lieutenant in the prestigious 1st Guides Regiment of the Belgian Army. It was a good posting, the kind that reflected his family's status. The Guides were mounted troops with a proud history, and Jean took to military life with an enthusiasm that might have surprised his former teachers. When World War II reached Belgium in May 1940, Jean de Selys Longchamps was still 27, and he turned 28 only a few weeks later. In peacetime, that would have been considered young. In war, particularly for someone about to embark on a completely new military career, it was practically ancient. But Jean's age didn't matter as much as what was about to happen to his country. The German invasion of Belgium in May 1940 was a masterclass in modern warfare. The Blitzkrieg came screaming out of the dawn on May 10th, and Belgium, despite the best efforts of its army, was simply overwhelmed. Jean saw action during those desperate days, leading his mounted troops and the partially mechanized units that Belgium had managed to field. He fought in the rearguard battles along the Scheldt River and other defensive lines, the kind of fighting where you knew you were buying time for someone else's retreat, where victory meant surviving another hour. Despite his noble background, Jean wasn't the kind of officer who directed battles from a safe distance. He wasn't afraid of the dirty, brutal reality of the battlefront, and he quickly proved himself to be a fierce and resourceful fighter, the kind of man soldiers would follow because he asked nothing of them that he wouldn't do himself. But Belgium's army, no matter how bravely it fought, was overwhelmed by the Blitzkrieg. The speed and violence of the German attack was unlike anything European warfare had seen before. Tanks and aircraft worked together in a coordinated assault that simply crushed traditional defensive lines. King Leopold III, facing impossible odds and the destruction of his country, made the agonizing decision to surrender on May 28, 1940, just 18 days after the invasion began. Jean de Selys Longchamps refused to accept that surrender. While thousands of Belgian soldiers laid down their arms, he resolved to continue fighting. What happened next says everything you need to know about the kind of man he was. In a move that required either incredible audacity or absolute desperation, possibly both, he found a way to ride on a German tank to escape the fighting. But the exact details of how he did this were never recorded, certainly nerves of steel, and the kind of luck that doesn't come around twice. His destination was Dunkirk, where the British were desperately trying to evacuate Allied soldiers from the beaches. He reached the French port town amid the chaos of what the British called Operation Dynamo, a scene of smoke and confusion and men wading into the surf hoping for rescue. Somehow, among the 338,000 Allied soldiers who were evacuated from Dunkirk's beaches by the Royal Navy in those frantic days of late May and early June, Jean de Selys Longchamps managed to board a departing ship. This narrow deliverance ended the Battle of France for him, but it was just the beginning of his war. Safely in Britain, at least for the moment, Longchamps was determined to get back into the fight. The idea of sitting out the war while his country remained under occupation was unthinkable. He volunteered to return to France with a group of Belgian soldiers who were trying to regroup and continue resistance. But France's rapid capitulation in June 1940 destroyed those plans before they could properly form. The speed of the French collapse shocked everyone. The French collapse shocked everyone who had expected the great fortress nation to hold out for months, perhaps years. Undeterred, Longchamps tried another route. He tried to reach Morocco and Gibraltar to join Allied forces, but during his travel through Vichy-controlled territory, he was captured and sent to a camp in Marseille. For a man like Jean, who had already escaped the Germans once, being locked up by French collaborators must have been particularly galling. But if the Vichy French thought that walls and guards would be enough to hold him, they had seriously underestimated their prisoner. Just as he had done with the German tank, Jean found a way out. The details of his escape from the French camp have not been fully recorded, but he managed to slip away and make a hazardous journey through neutral Spain. Spain in 1940 was technically neutral, but it was ruled by Franco's fascist government, which was sympathetic to the Axis powers. Getting through Spain without being arrested and turned over to the Germans required careful planning and likely the help of people whose names have never been recorded. By way of Gibraltar, that British rock at the southern tip of Spain, Jean finally reached England once more in late 1940. He had escaped captivity twice now, travelled across occupied Europe, and made it back to the only place where the fight against Hitler was continuing. Most men would have considered themselves lucky to be alive, and would have been content with a safe posting somewhere away from the front lines. Jean de Selys Longchamps immediately began looking for a way to get back into combat. In Britain, the Baron went straight to the Royal Air Force and volunteered to become a fighter pilot. It was an audacious goal. He wanted to transform himself from a cavalryman, a man who had led soldiers on horseback and in armoured vehicles, into someone who fought at 400 miles per hour in a machine that could kill you as easily as the enemy could. But there was a problem, and it was a significant one. The Royal Air Force usually preferred younger men for fighter training, so Jean's age made it harder for him to be accepted. The reasoning was sound enough. Learning to fly high-performance fighters required quick reflexes, excellent eyesight, and the kind of physical resilience that military planners associated with younger men. At 28, Jean was considered past his prime for this kind of work. A lesser man might have accepted this rejection and found another way to serve. Jean de Selys Longchamps was not a lesser man. He also had what might charitably be called flexible morals when it came to bureaucratic obstacles. So he did something that was either brilliantly pragmatic or completely outrageous, depending on your perspective. He simply forged his identity papers to make himself younger. It was a calculated risk. The British didn't have access to Belgian civil registry records. Belgium was occupied, its government in exile, its archives scattered or under German control. Because Belgium was occupied and records were disrupted, checking personal documents was very difficult, so verifying the age of volunteers was almost impossible. So when Jean presented papers claiming he was several years younger than his actual age, the British had no choice but to take him at his word. His audacity paid off. The Royal Air Force accepted him for pilot training, and Jean found himself starting an entirely new military career at an age when most fighter pilots were already veterans or dead. He began his training at the Free Belgian School at Odiham, then continued at number 61 OTU, where he earned his pilot wings in January 1941. It must have been a proud moment, receiving those wings, knowing that he had talked his way into a second chance at the war. By September 30th, 1941, Jean de Selys Longchamps was posted to number 609 Squadron in Royal Air Force Fighter Command. If he had wanted to get into the fight, he had certainly succeeded. Number 609 Squadron was a well-known RAF unit, and later it became one of the first squadrons to fly the new Typhoon fighter. The Hawker Typhoon was a powerful but temperamental machine. Number 609 Squadron had the mixed honor of being among the first units to fly it in combat, and the early months were a dangerous learning curve. Its 2,180 horsepower Napier Sabre engine made it extremely fast, and its 4 Hispano cannons could destroy almost any target. But the Typhoon had serious problems. Early models suffered from structural weaknesses, and in several cases the tail separated from the fuselage with fatal results. Even when the airframe held together, carbon monoxide sometimes leaked into the cockpit and slowly poisoned the pilot. Many pilots refused to fly it, calling the aircraft a widowmaker. Jean de Selys Longchamps was not one of them. He embraced the Typhoon's strengths and learned to manage its flaws. During 1942, Jean and his squadron carried out many low-level missions, including several rhubarb attacks on trains and convoys in occupied territory. He proved to be aggressive, skilled, and respected. Yet his thoughts remained fixed on Belgium. Through secret contacts, he learned about the arrests, executions, and fear spreading through his homeland, and he longed to strike back. Many later stories claimed, incorrectly, that Jean acted out of revenge for his father's death, but in reality, his father survived the war, and Jean's motive was much broader. Jean's true motive was broader. He wanted to hit the German security services and restore hope to Belgians living under occupation. He chose a target he knew from resistance reports, the Gestapo headquarters at 453 Avenue Louise, a place feared across Brussels. By late 1942, Jean had begun to think seriously about a plan, and by early January 1943, he shaped it into a clear idea while waiting for the right moment. He intended to join a regular mission, break away, and strike Brussels at low altitude. The RAF rejected his requests, most of which were made informally, because they believed the risk was too high and that pilots could not choose personal targets. Jean shelved the plan officially, but never let it go. His chance finally came on January 20th, 1943. The morning of January 20th dawned cold and clear over southeastern England. Number 609 Squadron received orders to fly a low-level rhubarb mission over Belgium, attacking German transport infrastructure. It was the kind of assignment they flew regularly. Get across the channel, find some trains or trucks, shoot them up, and get home before the Germans could organize a response. Longchamps and his close friend Flight Sergeant André Blanco, a fellow Belgian pilot who understood exactly what it meant to fight for an occupied homeland, were assigned to strafe a railway junction near Ghent in northwest Belgium. As Jean studied the maps that morning, he must have felt his pulse quicken. Ghent was in the northwest, but Brussels lay only about 50 kilometers to the south of their target area. 50 kilometers. For a Typhoon flying at maximum speed, that was barely a few minutes flight time. If he could slip away after hitting the railway yard, he could reach Brussels quickly, carry out his attack, and still make it back to England before anyone realized what had happened. The weather forecast showed clear skies over Belgium. Visibility would be perfect. Everything was aligning. Before takeoff, Jean made a few personal preparations that might have seemed odd to anyone paying close attention. He ensured his Typhoon was armed to the maximum, fully loaded with cannon ammunition far beyond what would be needed for a simple train strafing run. 4 20mm cannons could chew through their ammunition quickly, but Jean wanted to make sure he had enough for what he was planning. He also packed an unusual piece of cargo in his cockpit, a sack full of small Belgian flags. These tricolour flags, red and yellow and black, had been handmade by Belgian school children living in exile in London. Someone had given them to Jean, perhaps knowing what he had been planning, perhaps just as a gesture of solidarity. They were meant to be a parting gift for when he finally visited his homeland skies, a way to let his people know that they hadn't been forgotten. Longchamps took off from Royal Air Force Manston in Kent on the morning of January 20th, 1943, with Flight Sergeant Blanco on his wing. The 2 Typhoons climbed into the cold, clear air and turned toward the continent. They flew low across the English Channel, staying close to the wave tops to avoid German radar, and crossed into occupied Belgium. The 2 pilots reached the Ghent area and carried out their primary task, diving on the railway yards and strafing the trains with short bursts of cannon fire. Even during this engagement, Blanco noticed something unusual about his friend's flying. Longchamps was being sparing with his ammunition, firing only minimal bursts at the trains. It was as if he were saving his cannon shells for something else. Which, of course, he was. As the pair completed their mission and turned for home, Jean made his move. With sudden determination that must have been building in him all morning, he broke formation and peeled away to the southeast. Over the radio, he quickly instructed Blanco to continue back to base alone and not to follow him. Then, before Blanco could argue or ask questions, Longchamps switched off his radio set entirely. Blanco instantly understood what was about to happen. His comrade was heading to Brussels to finally carry out the unauthorized raid. We do not know what Blanco thought at that moment, because he never left a detailed account. Records only confirm that he returned to England as ordered, while Longchamps continued alone. Obeying Jean's final order, Blanco watched his friend's plane disappear towards the southeast. Then he turned his own Typhoon northwest and flew back to England alone, leaving Jean de Selys Longchamps to press solo towards the Belgian capital. One wonders what Blanco thought during that flight home. Whether he said a prayer for his friend, whether he envied him or feared for him, whether he wished he was going along. But orders were orders, even unofficial ones from a friend about to commit an act of magnificent insubordination. Flying just tens of meters above the ground to stay below German radar coverage, Longchamps navigated by sight over the familiar terrain of his homeland. This was a country he knew from childhood, fields and villages and rivers that he had seen from the ground in peacetime. Now he was seeing them from the cockpit of a British fighter, racing toward Brussels at speeds that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. He reached Brussels around 11 o'clock in the morning. The city spread out below him as he descended even lower, the Typhoon's engine roaring loud enough to rattle windows and turn heads in the streets. The weather was clear, just as the forecast had promised, and the element of surprise was absolute. No alarm had been raised. The Germans had no idea what was coming. Jean's flight path had been carefully chosen to set up his attack. He didn't just want to shoot up the building and leave, he wanted maximum impact, and that required getting the Germans where he could see them. So he first thundered down Avenue Louise itself at rooftop height, making a high-speed dummy pass directly over number 453. The Typhoon's massive Napier Sabre engine, roaring between the buildings of that quiet residential street, made an unearthly racket that echoed off the facades and shook the neighborhood. People in the streets must have frozen, looking up at this impossible sight. A British fighter plane, here in the heart of Brussels, flying so low you could almost see the pilot's face. As Jean had intended, the startling noise drew German personnel to the office windows of the Gestapo headquarters. Officers and clerks, administrators of terror, looked out to see what was making such a commotion. In a flash that probably lasted less than 2 seconds, the Typhoon was past them and gone, pulling up sharply. Longchamps hauled the Typhoon into a hard banking turn over the Bois de la Cambre, the beautiful park at the end of the avenue where Brusselites had once walked on Sunday afternoons. Now he was coming around for his firing run, lining up his approach from a different direction to maximize his advantage. He flew along Avenue de la Nation, known today as Franklin Roosevelt Avenue, then cut through a sharp turn onto Avenue Émile de Motte. This route gave him a direct line to the facade of the Gestapo building, and it had another crucial advantage. By coming in over these broad avenues and the park, he would have a clear shot at his target with minimal risk of stray fire hitting surrounding residential structures. Even in the heat of an unauthorized revenge attack, Jean was thinking about the civilians who lived near his target. At nearly treetop level, the lone Typhoon hurtled toward the building that had become synonymous with terror in occupied Belgium. Longchamps later described, in the brief accounts he gave before his death, how he lined up the building squarely in his sights as he approached. The convergence of his 4 cannons was set for a specific range, and he needed to be at exactly the right distance for maximum effect. In the next instant, all 4 of his Hispano 20mm cannons erupted with a thunderous volley that must have sounded like the end of the world to anyone inside that building. Longchamps raked the Gestapo headquarters from bottom to top with high explosive shells. He started firing at street level and pulled up the nose of his aircraft as he flew past, so that the stream of explosions walked up the facade like a giant's footsteps, shredding the masonry and penetrating every floor in turn. The 20mm shells weren't just bullets. They were explosive projectiles designed to destroy aircraft in flight, and against a building they were devastatingly effective. Eyewitnesses who saw the attack or emerged from cover immediately afterward described the scene as a sudden hell unleashed inside the building. Walls and windows were blown in by the force of the explosions. Office furniture was splintered into kindling. Terrified occupants dove for cover or were cut down in the open, caught in a maelstrom of flying glass and concrete and hot metal fragments. Longchamps made just a single firing pass, but in the context of the devastation he was able to inflict, that was more than enough. In those few seconds, the Typhoon probably fired only a short burst of about 40 to 80 rounds, which was still enough to cause serious damage to the front of the building. The Typhoon's combined rate of fire from all 4 cannons was about 40 to 50 rounds per second, and Jean held the trigger down for long enough to thoroughly chew up the face of the building. The sheer audacity and speed of the raid paralyzed the Germans. They scrambled to respond, of course. German guards may have tried to respond, but there is no strong evidence that the building had a fixed anti-aircraft gun on the roof, a defensive measure that perhaps should have been there all along, and the crew tried desperately to bring it to bear on this lone attacker. But by the time they realized what was happening, by the time they understood that the building was being torn apart by cannon fire, the British fighter bomber had already blasted past and was climbing away. Longchamps was extraordinarily careful not to hit other buildings. Despite flying at extreme low altitude, at high speed, while firing cannons and pulling up to avoid crashing into his target, he managed to keep every single shell inside the intended impact zone. This was a feat requiring incredible skill and concentration, the kind of flying that separated exceptional pilots from merely good ones. In that brief strike, at least 4 German personnel lost their lives, with many more wounded. Among the dead were some senior officers, men whose names appeared on official rosters and whose deaths the Germans couldn't completely hide, though they tried. Some German personnel were killed in the attack, but their exact names were never confirmed in official German or Allied records. Resistance sources suggested that several officers may have died, but historians today agree that the identities of the victims remain uncertain. At least 5 other Germans suffered serious injuries, though they apparently survived. But resistance sources operating in Brussels, people who had contacts inside the building or who gathered information in the confused aftermath, later asserted that the actual toll may have been significantly higher. Some claimed that between 25 and 30 Gestapo personnel were killed or wounded. The Nazi authorities, embarrassed by this brazen attack on their headquarters and unwilling to admit the extent of the damage, reported only a fraction of the casualties in their official statements. As plaster and glass and bodies lay shattered in and around 453 Avenue Louise, as fires started in offices and people screamed for help or tried to comprehend what had just happened, Jean de Selys Longchamps was already making his escape. He zoomed up and away from the devastation, having accomplished exactly what he had set out to do. But the Baron wasn't quite finished delivering messages to his occupied homeland. Reaching into his cockpit with one hand while flying with the other, Jean opened the sack of miniature flags he had brought from England. In a gesture of patriotic pride that must have seemed almost light-hearted after the violence of the attack, Longchamps scattered hundreds of little Belgian tricolour flags out of his plane over the city. They fluttered down through the clear January air like confetti, landing in streets and gardens, each one a tiny reminder that Belgium had not been forgotten, that someone was still fighting. He even dropped a large Belgian flag and a British Union Jack directly over the royal palace at Laeken, the residence of Belgium's exiled monarchy. The symbolism was deliberate and unmistakable. The legitimate government of Belgium and its British allies were still in the fight. Another Belgian flag he released over a neighbourhood in Schaerbeek landed, by chance or by Jean's careful aim, in the garden of his own niece, Baroness de Villegas de Saint-Pierre. One can imagine her reaction, looking up at the sound of the aircraft, seeing the flag drift down from the sky, and perhaps understanding in that moment who had just visited Brussels. With his mission accomplished in a way that exceeded anything he might have hoped for, Longchamps turned his Typhoon northwest and sped back toward the North Sea at maximum speed. Behind him, Brussels was already buzzing with the news of what had just happened. When Baron Jean de Selys Longchamps climbed out of his Typhoon at RAF Manston on January 20th, 1943, after he returned to RAF Manston around an hour after his attack on Brussels, celebration and consternation awaited him in equal measure. On one hand, the ground crews and personnel at RAF Manston greeted him warmly, impressed by what he had done. They were astonished and thrilled by his feat. The story came spilling out of him, probably in rapid-fire sentences while his hands were still shaking from adrenaline. The dummy pass, the firing run, and the moment he threw the Belgian flag over the city as a symbol of defiance. A lone Allied pilot had struck the hated Gestapo in broad daylight and lived to tell the tale. The airfield's personnel gave Jean a rousing welcome, proud and perhaps a bit envious of what one of their own had accomplished. His commanding officer was furious, and although Jean was praised privately, he was officially reprimanded and reduced in rank for acting without orders. Longchamps had blatantly disobeyed orders by embarking on this unauthorized adventure. He had broken away from the mission on the return leg, left his wingman, and switched off his radio so he could not be recalled to avoid being recalled, and attacked a target of that command. That promise echoes through history, reminding us that courage doesn't always come from massive armies or overwhelming force. Sometimes it comes from a single person who decides that enough is enough, that something must be done even if the rules say otherwise, even if the cost might be everything. Jean's story asks us to remember that the fight against tyranny has always depended on individuals willing to take extraordinary risks. His unauthorized mission wasn't just about destroying a building or killing enemy personnel. It was about sending a message that resonated far beyond the physical damage his cannons inflicted. The message was simple but powerful. Resistance is possible. Hope is justified. And those who seem invincible can be touched by someone brave enough to try. In the decades since that cold January morning in 1943, the world has changed in ways Jean couldn't have imagined. The Gestapo is gone, the Third Reich destroyed, and Belgium has been free for generations. But the fundamental truth that Jean demonstrated remains as relevant today as it was then. Evil must be confronted, injustice must be challenged, and sometimes the difference between despair and hope comes down to one person's willingness to act. The young people of Brussels who stop at the memorial today, who read the plaque and look at the bust of this daring pilot, live in a world shaped by the sacrifices of people like Jean de Selys Longchamps. They've never known occupation, never experienced the suffocating fear that comes from living under a regime that can make you disappear for looking at someone the wrong way. That freedom, that safety, was purchased with the courage of people who refused to accept that tyranny was permanent. Jean paid the ultimate price for his convictions, dying not in combat with the enemy, but in a tragic mechanical failure that robbed him of the chance to see his country liberated. But in the 7 months between his famous raid and his death, he had accomplished something that would outlive him by generations. He had given people a reason to believe in themselves again, to remember that they were not powerless, that they could fight back even when the odds seemed impossible. The story of Baron Jean de Selys Longchamps reminds us that history is made not just by generals and politicians, but by individuals who see injustice and decide to do something about it. His story teaches us that rules and regulations, while important, are not always more important than conscience. And his story shows us that one person, acting alone, can make a difference that echoes through time. If you want to hear more little-known historical stories, make sure to like the video and follow the channel. That's the best way to support me, so I can keep telling stories like this.